What's up guys, Vress here with a video that I thought might be fun for those of you who didn't play Vanilla WoW back in the day and are wondering what made it so different to the modern version. I also hope it can provide some nostalgic entertainment for those of you who did play back then. This isn't a video advocating for or against classic servers, nor is this list meant to be exhaustive. It's just a fun, light-hearted video to break up some of the heavier, more in-depth content on the channel. Anyway, you came here to see the list and I won't make you wait any longer. Here are 46 things you can expect to see in Vanilla WoW. I hope you enjoy the video. When you first log into classic servers, the very first thing you're going to notice is that things look very different. The game has seen various improvements to its graphics over the years, particularly when it comes to character models. Many of you will have experienced the old models as they were actually in use up to Warlords of Draenor, but if you joined recently, then some of this might be a surprise. It's not just the graphics that have changed either, the world is going to look totally different to anyone who joined the game after Cataclysm launched. The Cataclysm event transformed all of the old zones and turned them into something very different than what we experienced in Vanilla. The game's also going to be stripped back to the original 8 races, so that means no Blood Elves, Draenei, Goblins, Worgen or Pandaren, and certainly none of the allied races. None of their starting zones will be in the game either, as the Draenei and Pandaren zones didn't exist, the Goblin start zone was something entirely different, and the Blood Elf and Worgen start zones weren't accessible, or at least they weren't meant to be. Another thing that you're going to notice very early on is that leveling is slower, and I mean much slower. To reach level 60 you're probably looking at 10 days played or more if it's your first time. My advice is to focus on enjoying the journey, as power leveling in Classic can be a pretty depressing grind that I wouldn't recommend. The world itself presented far more of a challenge in Classic WoW than it does right now. You're definitely going to die more often while questing. If you pick up more than a couple of additional enemies in a fight, then there's a good chance that you're going down. If you're a Warlock or Hunter, then you probably have a better chance than most, but if you're a Warrior or Rogue, then forget it. You'll probably mincemeat unless your cooldowns are up. Due to the sheer scale of current WoW, you often find that the zones you visit are totally empty. However, you're not going to see that so much in Vanilla. Due to the player base being spread over a smaller area, you're going to end up bumping into people a lot more often. Another thing that you're probably going to notice is that storytelling wasn't as polished in Vanilla, and most of the time you were just following fairly random and unrelated threads that usually started and finished within the same zone. There wasn't really an overall story thread like you've seen featured in more recent expansions. There were a few quest lines that you followed through numerous zones, but back then it felt like the focus was more on exploration and discovering smaller story threads than following any kind of main path. The game also featured a lot less handholding when it came to quests. Sure, you'd still get that rather obvious exclamation mark over the quest giver's head, but once you picked up a quest, the objective wouldn't be marked on the map and you couldn't simply hover over the enemy to see if they were holding your quest item. You had to read the quest text and work it out for yourself. In current WoW, you're spoilt for choice when it comes to quests. There are so many quests available in every single zone that you're never going to complete all of them. However, in Vanilla this wasn't the case, and it often felt like there weren't enough quests to get you to max level. It wasn't quite that extreme, but there were a hell of a lot less quests than there are today, and you would often find yourself having to move between various zones just to find enough quests to complete a single level. By the way, I hope you like walking, because if you want the classic experience, then you're going to be doing a lot of it. There were far less options for fast travel in Vanilla WoW, and the flight points were both fewer and further apart. If you roll a human character, then you'll know what I mean when you decide to go and quest in the wetlands. There was of course no such thing as a fly-in mount either, so once you hit max level, you were still traversing the world using either flight paths, boats, or your trusty ground mount. Speaking of mounts, there were far fewer available. You essentially had your racial mounts as well as a small number that you could get from either grinding rep, such as the Alterac Valley mounts, or by looting a dungeon or raid boss, such as Baron Rivendare in Strathholm or Bloodlord Mandakir in Tulgurub. Getting your first mount actually used to be kind of a big deal back in the day. You couldn't get one until you hit level 40, and the cost of the 60% mount was 100 gold, which a lot of people didn't have at the point that they turned 40, and I don't think I knew anyone that had the 1000 gold required to get an epic mount at the point that they turned 60. You may be surprised to know that you didn't even have the mounts tab available, and you had to hold each mount as a separate item in your inventory. Another tab that you're going to find missing is achievements. Achievements simply didn't exist in Vanilla, so your friends are just going to have to believe you about the time that you did that really amazing thing. Group Finder is yet another feature that you're not going to see in Classic WoW. If you want to get a group together for a dungeon or raid, then you're going to have to actually work with other people to form one. Then you're going to have to find your way to the dungeon, because unless you have a Warlock in the group who's already there with 2 other people, then you're not getting teleported. The lack of a group finder in Vanilla WoW, and more specifically the lack of a teleport to dungeon feature, meant that there were faction specific dungeons in the game. Well, almost. Technically, you could take a 5-man group to the Stormwind Stockade as a Horde player, but based on its location, right in the middle of an Alliance city, it wasn't exactly easy as a group of level 25 Hordes. Dungeons weren't the face rolling experience that they are in current WoW either. Now I just want to make clear that I'm talking about leveling dungeons and normal difficulty dungeons at max level. Mythic Plus dungeons get far more difficult than any vanilla dungeon ever was. However, the bog standard dungeons will force you to take your time and think far more about tactics than you're probably used to right now. One of the big differences was the way that crowd control was used in dungeons. Crowd control these days tends to focus on AoE stuns. This is necessary due to the huge amount of cleave damage that's currently present in the meta. However, in vanilla there was a far greater focus on single target, and it was often essential to sap, polymorph, trap, and even sleep or seduce enemies in order to succeed. Another vanilla feature that has mostly become extinct in current WoW was the requirement of keys to enter dungeons. For example, you couldn't enter certain wings of the Scarlet Monastery without a key, nor could you enter Upper Blackrock Spire, Scholarments, or the Strathholm Service entrance, and that's not even the full list. Of course, you could always have a rogue pick the lock for you. Dungeons were only the start of your PvE adventures in Classic. Once you had enough gear from dungeons, it was time to take a crack at raids, and back then they required 40 players. This was simultaneously an epic experience and a total shit show. Organising 40 players was an absolute nightmare, but there was also something about 40 man that made raiding feel like it was on a whole different level. If you enjoy the looking for raid feature in current WoW, then I'm afraid to say that you're going to be losing this feature if you choose to play vanilla servers. The casual friendly versions of raids that you can experience using LFR simply didn't exist in vanilla. Unless you're willing to put in a significant amount of time, then you're probably not going to see many of the raids. Perhaps you'll manage to pug some Molten Core once everyone starts to outgear it, but your chances of setting foot in Naxxramas are pretty much zero. In fact, to even be able to set foot in several of the vanilla raids, you actually had to complete an attunement. This could be fairly simple, such as the Molten Core attunement, in which you had to simply do a single run of the Blackrock Depths dungeon, and not even to the end. Or sometimes they could be far more demanding, such as the Onyxia attunement that sends you all over the world and requires multiple dungeon runs to complete. What got me through the longer attunements was knowing that a whole host of epic loot was waiting on the other side. Back then there were very few epics available outside of raids, and it was extremely rare to see one drop. This made epics feel pretty exciting and special, and that's something that's been greatly diminished now that you're kitted in full epic gear almost instantly when you hit max level. Legendaries were even more rarefied, and there were only a handful that existed back in vanilla. The chances of ever getting your hands on one were incredibly low, even if you were part of a decent raiding guild, as they had very low drop rates, and were from bosses that could only be killed once per week. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and roses when it came to loot in vanilla. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but there were some totally pointless items that provided no real use whatsoever. While leveling, you would come across cloth items that offered plus agility, which was of course almost entirely useless to cloth wearers. Then, once you got into endgame, you'd come across useless, rare and epic items such as Thunderstrike, a very underpowered polearm that earned the name of Vendor Strike, as that's where it ended up every time it dropped in Molten Core. Another fun quirk of gearing up for endgame in vanilla WoW was the inclusion of spell resist gear. You used to have to spend hours farming this resistance gear for particular raid encounters, and the tragic thing was that a lot of this gear was totally useless in every other situation, so you couldn't even enjoy it outside of raids. While we're still on the topic of gear, crafted gear was actually worth the effort in vanilla. Crafted items like Robe of the Void and Robe of the Archmage remained viable items well into endgame dungeons and raids. Also, item level didn't exist in Classic, so people were a little less fixated on your gear score when it came to accepting you into a group or guild. Of course, as things got more serious, gear requirements did go up, but you certainly weren't anonymously entering your item level into a group finder in the hopes of getting a pickup dungeon group together. If you feel like current WoW is grindy, then you're in for a shock when Classic servers roll out. Raid preparation was on another level back then. You'd spend every non-raid night farming the different equipment and materials required to take part. Obviously there's still a good amount of this going on in current WoW, but back then it was seriously intense. Class identity isn't something that's necessarily missing in current WoW, it's just very different. In vanilla, each class had a lot of interesting side quests and mechanics that always felt quite exciting and mysterious for those of us who didn't play them. Rogues would be sent off to learn lockpicking and poisons, warlocks would travel deep into enemy territory to learn to summon new demons, and priests had that really cool quest to get the benediction staff. It was such an investment to level a new character that most of us didn't really have more than a couple, and for that reason classes felt so much more mysterious and unique. Another thing that you're going to experience is the old talent trees, in which you would allocate points in a far more flexible way than you can right now. You could even spread your talents across multiple specs. However, it is worth mentioning that if you wanted to raid, then you were pretty much forced into a cookie cutter build anyway, so it never really felt that flexible for those of us taking part in that content. In fact, if you wanted to change any of it, then you'd have to pay a fee to your class trainer, and this cost went up each time until it hit, I think, a 50 gold cap. Now 50 gold was actually kind of a lot of money back then, so in that sense it actually gave us a lot less flexibility than what we have currently. It wasn't just respecs that cost money back then either. You actually had to pay to learn your new spells every 2 levels, and sometimes you wouldn't even have enough gold to do so. This was often the experience if you were playing a class with a large number of spells such as the Warlock, as the cost would really start to rack up. You just had a lot more abilities in general during vanilla, as all spells were available for every spec, regardless of the spec that your build focused on, the exception being spells that you unlocked from your talent tree. Speaking of classes and builds, there was actually a lot more class imbalance in vanilla. No way was a hunter out DPSing a rogue or mage in the majority of raid encounters, and that didn't really change throughout the whole of vanilla. Then when it came to PvP, it often felt more like a game of rock, paper, scissors, providing you had equal gear and skill to your opponent. Some classes even had totally useless talent trees that would result in builds that were so suboptimal that they were never even used. Balance druids and survival hunters instantly spring to mind. Another fun fact about classes is the fact that rogues actually had a couple of extra professions to level as part of their kit. These were lockpicking and poison, which unlike in current WoW, they would actually have to level up to 300, just like any other profession. Then you had the various items that different classes had to carry. Famously, hunters had to carry arrows in order to use their bows. This was extremely tedious for them, not to mention expensive. And perhaps the biggest challenge of all was finding room in their inventory. Other classes weren't totally exempt though. For example, druids had to carry acorns to battle res, and rogues had to carry flash powder in order to vanish. Perhaps the most frustrating of all was the one that I personally experienced, and that was soul shards. As a warlock, you had to drain the soul of your enemies in order to harvest soul shards. Each shard actually took a slot in your inventory, and without them you couldn't cast certain spells. That included some very essential spells such as summon player or summon pet. I still think paladins had it worse though. They were essentially sold a lie. They'd been told that they were going to be these plate wearing warriors of the light, but really they just ended up wearing dresses in raids and having to cast a fresh set of buffs every 5 minutes. Yep, you didn't mishear me, blessings only lasted 5 minutes back then. Another quirk of vanilla WoW was the fact that you actually had to level up your weapon skill. If you picked up a brand new weapon of a type that you hadn't used before, then you'd have to level it from 1 to 300 before it was viable in max level content. This one goes on the admittedly short list of things that I don't miss about vanilla. Something I do miss though was the community. Prior to the server merges, you spent a lot of time with the same people and you got to know most people on your server. If you didn't have respect for others, then you were no longer welcome in groups, and this kept everything far more civil in general. Though one thing that was far from civilized was the absolute gankfest that was world PvP. The thing that made the world feel so dangerous on a PvP server was the fact that you would come across the opposing factions a lot more frequently than you do these days, and more often than not, someone was going down. The most frustrating part of getting killed was the long corpse runs that were part and parcel of the vanilla experience. There were just far fewer graveyards, and sometimes you'd have to cover almost an entire zone as a ghost. This was particularly painful if someone decided they were going to camp you. Classic WoW also featured a totally different honour system in which only a small number of players on each server could gain the best ranks. If you want to be Grand Marshal or High Warlord when vanilla servers come out, then prepare for it to take over your entire life. Of course, it wasn't all about world PvP, and there was plenty of battleground action too. Now, you've probably played plenty of Alterac Valley matches in your life, but have you ever played one that went on for days? Back in vanilla, I genuinely left an AV game on Saturday morning and rejoined it on Sunday evening to find that little to no progress had been made by either faction. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed my list of things to expect when playing vanilla WoW for the first time, and I look forward to hearing your additions in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to my channel for regular content. You can expect weekly MMO and RPG videos as well as regular live streams on Twitch. I've also recently set up a Patreon page if you want to be extra awesome and support me on there. All links are in the description. Either way, take care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.